Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin Sense, South Africa's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. As always, I am joined by a panel of brilliant South Africans scattered around the world. Joining us from Germany, where he runs the Bremen Democracy Research Group, the villain of the Visser, James Myberg. Released from Ed Davies's dungeon, the director of wealth of Audley Capital, the newly converted eco-warrior of Earl's Court, Simon Lincoln Reeder. Hopping across the Atlantic, we are joined by the director of the Yorktown Foundation for Freedom, the health secretary of Columbia Heights, Richard Tren, and finally, joining us from the Common Sense HQ, the founder of France Crenier Private Clients, the editor of the Common Sense, the journalist of Jeffreys Bay, France Crenier. We have a jam-packed show today, gentlemen. But I think we'll start with you, Simon, given that any second now, Ed Davies might be coming to reclaim you and throw you back into the dungeon. And so, Simon, you're going to tell us about the Keir Starmer's new plan for digital IDs.
Okay, Julie, if I can just to take you back there, we're not allowed to talk about this anymore, okay? Because it's not a nice experience being having your office bombed and being rendered to a Green Party black site. They're very nice and stuff, you know. They introduce themselves by their pronouns because the last thing that you want to do is misgender your kidnapper. But I'm very happy to be back here, and I think, you know, just to caveat the ID discussion, which was announced 2 days before the Labour conference, I think 2 weeks ago. This isn't a new thing. It's been running around the political circles for the last 2 decades in various iterations. And the latest conceptual form from 2020 has obviously been a digital identity. But this was a theme explored by the Conservative government in 2010 in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. Lucky them. But they dismissed it because then civil liberties still meant something to the political elite, and civil liberties, the idea that privacy is a virtue and that these projects can invariably be compromised. Now, so as I said, 2 days before the Labour conference, Keir Starmer stands up and he says this is going to happen before the end of this parliament, which points it toward 2029, a nationwide rollout. In between 2 weeks ago and 2010, when the Conservatives dismissed the idea, it was renewed in 2020 by the Tony Blair Institute. And he felt that it would be a very good idea in light of being able to identify vaccinated people and unvaccinated people. And there's been no real pushback subsequently. And Starmer's gone ahead with this idea now that by 2029, everyone's going to have it. He's on the immigration side. So Tony Blair says that it's good to track vaccinations in 2020, and Keir Starmer in 2025 says it's good to track illegal immigration. Now, what's the common link there? It's the word track, isn't it? In 2020, we started doing some research on a project entitled the Permanence of Recognition, which some free speech guys and I here started. And keeping in touch with these people and how they've mapped out the process and what can go wrong, it's a pretty hairy line. And just on the point of where this is coming from, why is there this rush to centralized biometric storage of information? And the government appears to be influenced by what's been happening on the continent, in particular in Estonia, where they've had it, and other countries have it in various forms. But Estonia is probably the most advanced. Do you know what the population of Estonia is? It's 1.3 million people. There's 75 million people in the UK. It's just another thing. These Labour government likes the Norwegian and Swedish welfare and tax models, but it's incongruent. And what happened in Estonia in 2017 is very interesting. So they've got a population of 1.3 million people. 750,000 of those people had their details leaked by this same system. So the chances of things going wrong are really quite high here. But let's just go through a couple of the numbers just to give our audience a sense of what's going on. Now, you've got to see this through the context of the British government not really understanding numbers, and that is material in the people they appoint at the Treasury and so on. But they've come out and said after Starmer's announcement that this is going to cost between 40 and 140 million pounds to implement. Okay. Tony Blair thinks it's going to cost $1 billion. He's probably closer, but I'd say based on the experience of the high-speed rail debacle, that's probably 4 billion short. Okay. The number they've calculated at the annual management fee is 100 million. It's probably around 600 million short. 2.1 million people have signed a petition, and I think that's gone up since I last saw. But 2.1 million people have signed a petition against digital identity. That gives you an idea. That was since Starmer announced it in the time period. That's like a Pokemon Go take-up. It's a huge number of people to object. HMRC reckons that it will give them a windfall of 600 million pounds in tax revenues every year. And the Tony Blair Institute comes back and says that the government can potentially save £2 billion a year by welfare misappropriation, and this will provide the correct apparatus to monitor parties and groups that often take these things for a bit of a ride. Welfare. So we're left in this position now where this is a huge project. There are people coming out. But I want to go back. There are people coming out to defend it from the government side. But I want to go back to the people I spoke to during the years that Tony Blair had first announced a digital ID for the vaccinated. And these are very smart people. They're actuaries, they're scenario mappers. And they have produced a really comprehensive document in the same theme of the permanence of recognition, which doesn't just speak to civil liberties. Civil liberties are critical, but it also speaks to the ease at which a system, if fully activated, can switch to payments. Now, you don't want government in any role like that, but this is the potential feature of its future. As it relates to the what it will do, look, I don't think that there is much of a social contract left, the relationship that democracy has with its citizenry. But this will almost certainly break what is left of it. The idea of illegal immigration is strong. It's where the zeitgeist, certainly on the right, is. But does it warrant this sort of overreach? Does it warrant this sort of system? I'm not sure it does. And 2.1, as I said, even more people today will tell you otherwise. Yeah, so we're in this position now where it's apparently definitely coming. Service providers are being eyed, including Larry Ellison of Oracle and even Tony Blair's own son's firm. So who knows what will come, but I'm not convinced, and this is an important point I'll finish this section on. I'm not convinced that the political resistance that we've seen to any of Labour's opposites, any of Labour's opponents, is in any way reassuring. I don't think that there is the level of loyalty to the concept of civil liberties as there was. And I think that any government that sees something like this and that promises efficiency, that promises more revenues collected, is going to jump at it. It's obvious that it will. But where will that leave the country, or an already fractured country with a very diminished trust in politics. I think that this is it won't be good. Back to you, Gabriel.
Yeah, Richard?
Sorry. Simon, what's the deal with debanking at the moment in the UK? I mean, because this kind of thing, we use the word Orwellian far too bandied about, but this does seem like the most Orwellian thing I've ever heard of. But that combined with the ability of the state to just debank people, and with so much banking on our phones that they can track. I mean, there was, a well-known case with Nigel Farage being debanked. Is there legislation against that now? And if this goes through without that, can the government basically just debank people and make them impossible to go about their lives unless they comply with whatever Keir Starmer wants them to comply with?
It's a very interesting point, Richard. And that you speak about legislation. There was supposed to be, but it got held up in the transition of government for last year. And as I understand, it's still sitting there. And this was passed for our audience in the wake of Nigel Farage being debanked by Coots, who are bankers to the Queen here, on the basis that his views didn't align with theirs. And Nigel Farage is a very high-profile, prominent guy. It's happened to a lot of other people that aren't as prominent, that have had their Facebook scrutinized and then a call from their banks. So I think that there is that threat still. And with something like digital ID, it doesn't take a genius to understand that it lessens that process, the process significantly. There's a huge ease as to identifying someone, having all their records, and what is the records that you keep with digital ID? They say it's going to be biometric information and so on. In a place like Kazakhstan, which is, and this admittedly was a private sector initiative, the CAPSI app, which is an app you can actually buy a car with because it stores your driver's license, your ID, your bank details, and so on. And it's commonplace there. But no one system is going to be able to, there can't be a one-size-fits-all approach to this. So you've got the technical difficulties to start with. They should have passed that legislation, but as I said, it's being held up. And then that falls into the philosophical angle here, the dimension in which you see, actually, I don't want the government knowing about where I bank, or I don't want the government to follow my movements. But digital ID is the sort of equivalent API into that model.
James, over to you.
Can you just explain the difference, if this is one, to what we have in South Africa, for instance, with, everyone has an ID number and an ID card. Does this go from nothing to something much more extreme than that, or is it
correct?
Was it similar to that?
So it's going to have, look, everyone has got a British passport. Most people have got British passport in the same way that South Africans have got IDs, but and driver's license for that matter. But when this is put into a giant server, when all of this information is stored in a centralized digital storage, from my understanding, is that firstly there's technical problems which could result in your personal details being leaked, and then secondly, there's the trust issue, James. And I don't know quite how it works at the Department of Home Affairs in South Africa, but I can imagine it's very clunky, and bandages are put onto leaks and problems with that system. And some of them, I'm sure, would be well documented. But here, you've got very powerful tech firms that could potentially produce something like an overarching that stores all of that information. And then how does one control exactly what the government knows, and what's the criteria, and what are the rules around what the government is allowed to access of that? It opens up, at least with the South African identity document, you don't have to explain that you bank at Capitec. You don't have to tell them how much crypto you have or when you last traded gold. But the feeling is here that all of those concerns will be accessed by this new initiative.
James?
Yeah, just something that, I mean, having recently been in London, something that's quite sort of shocking is that, I remember when 20 years ago, you went to London and there were all these cameras, and the argument was, well, that's to combat terrorism or crime or whatever. And now you can't even use your sort of runabout car to go to the shops if it's a diesel or a petrol car without paying a massive fee. With all the cameras, they're everywhere, and they'll pick you up if you just try and go to the shops. You'll get charged money for that through the sort of surveillance state. So I can very well see how
You see what it is.
a digital ID is going to be used for things that are not even conceivable today.
Yeah, it's all of those things. If you're going to connect security camera, CCTV, you connect the automatic number registration that the police drive around with. This is going to be like just one massive technology exercise with a small country attached to it eventually.
Richard, I'm going to go to you first and then to Franz.
Yeah, just a quick comment to say that we've already seen in the UK how eager people were to report on others. During COVID, the number of times that people were reported to the police for being out of their house for more than an hour or for walking their dog. So this is being introduced in a country that I'm very glad to hear that 2.1 million people have signed a petition. But there are a lot of other people there who are just desperate to police their neighbors. And so add this to this, it's extremely disturbing that they'll have this new power.
Yeah.
Well, knowledge is power. And so privacy is very important to sustain civil rights because it limits the knowledge that the state has of what you do. And that's why in a free society, the police need a warrant to search your house or obtain your bank accounts or read your cell phone call log. And a ID of this nature is a big step in a very different direction, where the knowledge of what you do and how and why and what you read and what you spend money on and where you go all become centralized in the state. And so it undoes completely one of the most important guarantees of living in a free and open society, that the state will not have knowledge of a lot of what you do in your private life unless you've committed an offense or threatened the state, and then a court might grant a warrant, which is and the fact that courts in democratic societies that the police can't just wander into your house shows just how important the idea of privacy has historically been in free societies, and how alarming it is that a move like this would occur in the UK. And there are a few million signatures on that petition, apparently, but I think vast complacency. And my last point, Gabriel, is maybe one of the others has done more on this, but this kind of digital ID lends itself to what you might call a social virtue score. That the state can sort of rate your behavior of whether you're a virtuous person or not a virtuous person. Whether you drive your diesel-powered car around the wrong parts of London. And once that starts to happen, you've taken an even greater leap away from the sort of basic tenets of privacy that have historically been so important in free societies.
Correct.
Yeah.
And France, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's already inactive. That's in China. I think they do something quite aligned to that social credit score model. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And just on that point, I think it's what's so interesting about the UK, and I think we'll touch on it in the second topic around free speech, but the society seems to be abandoning its kind of core liberal principles, the thing that built the country, made the country into the great economic power it is, not in like a kind of rush or whatever, but a small inch by inch step at a time. That that you, as James pointed out, 20 years ago the cameras went up, and then 10 years ago it was decided that if your car consumed petrol or diesel wasn't wanted in the City of London. And it happens just an inch at a time. And what it seems to demonstrate is kind of the effect of the boiling frog. That if you turn the temperature up really slowly, then people don't actually realize, or don't seem to, that by the time they realize what's gone on, it's already too late. And it does seem as though this kind of increasingly bureaucratic, technocratic way of governing has overtaken almost every institution in the UK. But on that note, I think we'll switch to a much more cheery country, and that is our home, South Africa. Because France, our president has a new, actually the ANC has a new economic plan, and they're going to rescue the South African economy. Can you believe it? Can you just tell us about it?
Yeah, well, on 2 days ago, the ANC came out of a meeting of its executive committee, which had been held over 3 days, and one of the objectives of that meeting was to come up with a plan to address South Africa's weak economic performance. Now, if you're not familiar with that weak performance, a World Bank report that came out yesterday does a really good job of highlighting it. That report looks at Southern Africa's economy. It's upped its growth forecast for the region into 2027 to 4.4%, but South Africa's number is at around 1. And the World Bank report, in a few places, does so quite diplomatically, says, South Africa is a vast drag now on the growth of Southern Africa, which it's been for a while. The emerging markets over the last decade plus have been growing at a rate in excess of 4%, and South Africa has been growing at 1%. The world's unemployment rate is at around 5%, just above that, and South Africa's rate is at 33 or something at the moment. So it's 6 times the global average. So coming out of this meeting, and I've got some quotes here, so and it's sometimes best just to quote, is Mr. Ramaphosa said coming out of the meeting that the persistence of low economic growth, severe unemployment, and the impact of global trade instability is what has informed this document that his colleagues have called the Economic Action Plan. And he goes on, in fact, to say that South Africa is in an economic emergency, and that this plan will now fix that. Now, if you've followed South Africa, you'll know we've got so many plans, we can barely keep up with them. We have long ones and short ones and every acronym you can think of, and it feels like, and it probably is, we've been publishing a new plan, sort of economic turnaround strategy every quarter or 6 months for the past decade. Then Mr. Ramaphosa says a very telling thing on all these plans. And now, of course, he has to justify why there's now another plan. And he says this, he says we have made progress over the last few years, with now reference to all these plans, in advancing economic restructuring and transformation, in improving our capacity to increase infrastructure investment. And he says we've made great strides in progress in our logistics sector. And then he says, goes on in this vein, he says, but the impact of our work is yet to be felt in our growth and unemployment figures. And that's very telling, that for the better part of a decade, you've been driving all sorts of plans. You've made great strides in those plans. They've done much for investment and restructuring. But the impact of this work is yet to be felt in our growth and employment figures. And we wrote an editorial about this, and in that we said, that we'd like to think that if it was true, if you've acknowledged that every plan for the past decade has got you nowhere, that you might think that it's time to produce a new plan with new thinking. But that's not what Monday evening revealed. Instead, here it goes. There were 10 key things. I'll go through some of them. The first one was that there'll be preferential electricity tariffs for the chrome, manganese, and steel industry. Now, South Africa's steel industry is almost kaput, and the state is desperate to resuscitate it. And South Africa also has vast shortages of electricity. So the plan on steel, the the preferential tariffs essentially comes down to making businesses that are still in operation pay more for electricity in order to save the steel industry, which is rapidly going out of business. And on the back of, and consumers will pay as well more for electricity because someone's got to pay for it. Steel industry won't, so those in business will. And it's just a non-starter to try and resuscitate an industry of that nature. Then there's logistics in South Africa is a complete snarl-up. Railways aren't working, the ports are failing. A recent report on global ports ranked some of South Africa's as amongst the worst performing in the world. The one was actually stone last out of 400 plus countries. And Mr. Ramaphosa says Transnet's recovery plan, now Transnet's got some of the railways and linked to the ports. Transnet's recovery plan and the implementation of that plan and upgrading port operations and upgrading export corridors is what we have to do. But that's fine. But to date, they've been minimal. They've been minimal. There've been efforts in that direction, but at each kind of juncture, the state pulls back because private entry into ports and railways starts to sort of, the idea of it reaches a point where the state would actually have to cede control of the assets. And the state sees that as surrender of strategic assets, is not prepared to countenance it. So we move some way towards port and rail refitment, and then we pull back when that critical point is reached. Well, now actually private operators need to take them over and run them properly. To rebuild our chrome and manganese industries, the proposal is for export tariffs. So you'll tax companies that wish to export, and you'll introduce duties on imports. So you undermine your export economy and export earnings, and you increase your domestic costs by dutying imports of those products off the back of what I've told you is a 1% rate of economic growth. And then it gets into some really kind of difficult territory, the rest of the plan. To improve the capacity of the state to manage major projects, a project management cadre will be professionalized to manage these projects. So deployed sort of politicians or civil servants who do a terrible job will be professionalized to do a much better job, which just won't work if in South Africa's case, without mass prosecutions through the civil service and adjusting state procurement legislation to focus on merit and cost in how contracts are put together. But beyond that, the whole thing is so wrong-headed that you've got a very expert private sector that's just yearning to commit to some of these projects with some of the best sort of management skills in the world. And yet the plan is to professionalize the state to do this. Small business growth is going to be achieved by turning state funding institutions into what are called catalytic investors. So the state is going to invest in small businesses and get small business going. And apparently at the meeting ahead of this, there was a concern that, well, the view was expressed that commercial banks won't lend to small businesses out of sort of vindictiveness, which is, that level of argument is absurd to suggest that the banking industry is hostile to the interests of the economy, and therefore the state needs to take over the funding of businesses. If banks aren't lending, you think to ask why that might be and address that, not short circuit the banks. Then on how to grow provincial economies, the idea is that the growth of provincial economies needs the revitalization of what will be state-run industrial parks with localization targets and the aligning of these with special economic zones and corridor planning. Now that we wrote in a note is you could literally have lifted that line from a report, if you know what this is, the State General Planning Commission, which went by the name GOS Plan, which was the responsible for central economic planning in the Soviet Union. And on it goes and on it goes. And the almost the most extraordinary thing about it is the ANC itself is at 40% of the vote now because its past plans haven't worked. And it's well on its way to 30% and will probably be somewhere around that in local elections scheduled for next year or early 2027. And even at that sort of desperate point, the planning and economic thinking coming out of that party seems to deteriorate in quality relative to what that party had achieved in its first decade in government, when it raised levels of private investment and, as a consequence, the rate of growth, and achieved quite significant levels of job creation. So if you're someone who cares about the ANC and its future, people writing this stuff are running a real risk that they're going to completely crash this party.
Yeah, France, and on that point, I think this might be a good kind of entry way into talking about something that we haven't really done a great me haven't had a great discussion on, which is the kind of the power of the free market and why we are so insistent on a lot of and the ANC removing a lot of the kind of concrete shoes that they put onto the economy. And I think this plan demonstrates one of the key kind of points around that. You meant it kept referring to the manganese and the chrome industry and the steel industry. And one of the points you'd made on the in the kind of question on digital IDs is that the state should be limited in knowing how much on what individuals do. But one of the kind of hallmarks of economics, and why you actually have a free market economic system, is that the state is also limited in its ability to understand what is going on throughout the country, right? It's a problem of centralization. By the time all of the information in the country reaches the state, it's probably outdated and wrong. And so you have a free market to solve for this problem by disaggregating decision making to the kind of lowest possible um, the lowest possible level. So you allow individuals the ability to decide their economic futures, because if you don't do that, you'll essentially have a state which is obsessed with trying to revive dead industry, as opposed to looking forward and to the future as to what can South Africa be. It says we need to it always has to kind of harken back to something that we were, and never allows the possibility for the creation of development of new industry, of new economic outputs that define South Africa. And so I think this is the clearest indication that the ANC is trapped in this kind of archaic understanding of economics. It isn't even the understanding of economics of modern day communists who kind of this is demonstrated by China, who understand that the free market is a useful instrument, you know.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's even before that. If you're a very efficient state, maybe to some extent you can try some of the. I mean, I left out some things for you. Here's how to fix small towns and rural areas. Is going to be via state-run municipal local economic development technical units. Employment is going to be achieved via a massive scale-up of public employment programs, which means that the state will employ people. Which it can't, because it runs into the reality of the budget deficit. And if you raise the deficit, you send the currency on a run, and you import inflation, and you undermine the living standards of poor people. And so it's all. I'd say even before you get to your point, there's just a point of maybe some states could aspire to some of this stuff. It still wouldn't work very well, but this is a state that's struggling to get some of its basic functions sorted out. Its airline went very badly, and they're trying to resuscitate it. in suburbs of Johannesburg, the industrial center of Africa, there's unreliable water supply now, which shouldn't be the case. And it's just this disconnect between the reality on the ground and the idea that you'll conjure up a municipal local economic development technical unit run by what are they, new project cadres, professional cadres who will use state-run catalytic investors to revitalize state-run industrial parks and set the localization targets while aligning these with special economic zones as part of the corridor planning. To turn the water on in Johannesburg is step one. And then beyond that the loser in all of this ultimately is you could argue the greatest loser. You'd have a difficult time arguing it was anyone else. The greatest loser is the ANC itself, which is just seeing its support, fall to levels that are unbelievable to look at when you see the data. And yet, if you I suppose if you meet people one-on-one in that party, senior people, they'll hear this conversation, they might go along with it to a surprising degree. But when the group gets together in what's essentially the Politburo, which is what the executive committee that is responsible for this plan essentially is, when the group gets together, it's just doubling down on strategies and ideas and policies that are completely, will without doubt, continue to set up a situation where huge bites are taken out of the ANC's national vote share.
Richard, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, Frans, I might disagree with you a bit about who the biggest loser is. Obviously, the ANC are losers in doubling down on this just terrible policies that we've known for decades will only lead to more poverty. The biggest losers are the unemployed, are the poor, the people whose futures are being destroyed by a continued adoption of these insane policies. And if anybody wants more, if anybody doubts this, have a look. The Fraser Institute puts out annually the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and any of our viewers or listeners can go to EFOTW, Economic Freedom of the World, EFOTW.org, and just have a look at what the outcomes are. Freer countries have more growth, and with that growth come all the better outcomes. Better healthcare, better results for women, better education. Everything comes from this. It's quite amazing that the ANC is doubling down on this. And it reminds us, I've said this before, we have to keep reminding ourselves of Friedrich Hayek's great quote, that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. I don't know what else there is to say on this. This is so depressing. I will note quickly, and I think I posted this yesterday in our little group, that one of the provisions in this plan is that Cyril says that he wants merit-based appointments are going to be non-negotiable. Well, does that extend to the private sector? Are we getting rid of all these employment laws that go against that?
No, but it's the same as let me first deal with who's the biggest loser. I mean, I obviously agree with what you say, but I do mean that the ANC is the biggest loser, because the poor remain poor, get more poor to a degree. But the ANC is the biggest loser because it was once this colossus. It had almost 70% of the vote in the country at a time when the rate of economic growth was 5% and investment rate was much higher than it is now. Now it's at 40, heading for 30. It's actually lost in a sort of, if you measure what you have lost, the ANC has lost more than anyone else. And in actual kind of the quantity of what is lost, the poor's lives have remained terrible and desperate. So I do mean that ANC is the big loser. On what? Sorry, what was your second point?
Just on
Because-
anybody who doubts this, what we're saying here, could just look at the economic freedom of the world. Decades of policies across the world. This, growth has nothing to do with race or religion or anything, geography. It has to do with these basic economic policies. And the record is clear. Do the opposite of what the ANC is doing.
Oh, what I
Sorry,
wanted
France,
to say,
Richard.
yeah.
It was the point. The point was on Ramaphosa saying merit is non-negotiable.
Sorry. Yes, sorry.
Yes.
I also, Richard also said it's depressing, and on the poor, I wanted to say that the poor do have agency in South Africa. They have the ability, if they're frustrated at what they see around them, to vote differently. South Africa is a completely free society. And it's not, it's I suppose if you're an ANC person or of that background or care about the ANC, then this is depressing. But there's another aspect to this too that's actually not that depressing, because as this has happened, and as the rate of as the economic performance has worsened and living standards, and we maintain high levels of poverty, actually the right thing has started to happen, that the voting behavior of ordinary people has shifted to a massive extent to bring about that 40% number headed to 30% in the next local government elections. And therefore, if you consider the poor have agency in South Africa, it's not a dictatorship as it once was, where you were a vassal of the state and had very little power. You have great power to bring about change to society. And I think people are doing that. Ordinary people are changing South Africa much faster in many respects than the elites and the wealthy and the business community who sometimes sort of say something must be done, but aren't actually brave enough to do what must be done. Ordinary people are doing it, and therefore, if you can sort of get past the immediate horror of the poverty, you look into the longer term. It's actually, it's not depressing. There's a democracy that's working to correct this, driven by ordinary people. And that, again, just makes it, again, extraordinary that the ANC, seeing this happen around it, is stuck in this sort of 1950s Soviet planning mode, even though people have overtaken it, which I think we'll be able to demonstrate in the show whenever Gabriel takes us to the pit about where South Africans stand on their policy preferences. We'll show you some polling data, which shows that as this is actually quite a good thing to do in one show. You've got this kind of Soviet dogmatic policy planning, and then you're going to hear another section about this populace, the great bulk of which, ANC, DA, black, white, doesn't matter, has far overtaken the ANC now in terms of the ideas and the policies that it would entertain in order to correct what Mr. Ramaphosa calls what did he call it? The persistence of low economic growth and severe unemployment. Ordinary people have very shrewd ideas on what to do about that. But and the ANC, and if you listen to that stuff and then think back to this plan, now stands in a dangerous strategic position where it is at odds with the policy wishes of its own remaining voters, let alone those who've already left the party.
Very good points.
So I'm gonna, before we get to the polling around ANC voters' policy preferences, we're gonna take a stop off to America, and we're gonna actually we'll do a double feature, America, then back to the UK to talk about free speech. And one of the interesting points that kind of came into my head as you were talking, France, when you were talking about the fact that the ordinary people in South Africa are leading the change. The reason what is so important, and why that we're going to do a kind of double act on this topic, is that the reason ordinary people can even lead a change like this in a society is because of the kind of freedoms they have, with the primary freedom enabling that being the freedom of speech. So Richard, can you take us through maybe some of the kind of historic tradition in the US and just
Yeah.
kind of an overall kind of contextual view of freedom of speech?
Yes, free speech is a fundamental cornerstone of this country, and our free speech rights stem from, in a very different way to those in our constitution, to those extended to other countries, like in South Africa, where the constitution and European constitutions are filled with positive rights. These are rights that you have the right to healthcare, you have the right to education, you have the right to this, that, and the other, and these all require the government to give you those rights. Our system is filled with negative rights. Our constitution presupposes that we have rights, and our constitution stops the government from interfering with those rights. We are, as it says in our Declaration of Independence, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, such as the right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, the first, second, and the first 10 amendments, restrict the government from from impinging on those rights. Like we have a Second Amendment that guarantees our right to keep and bear arms, and our First Amendment reads, and I printed it out so I can get it right: the Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or of abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for the redress of grievances. So that's our First Amendment, and it doesn't come from nowhere. These are English ideas. These come from Britain. And we're going to hear from Simon about where Britain is at the moment. But these are ideas put out by people like John Stuart Mill and Milton. Britain had free speech rights, but they were always limited. And this is the first time that free speech rights are guaranteed for everybody by limiting what the government can do. And why are these the cornerstone? Well, of our society, I think why they've led us to become the most prosperous and powerful country on earth is because in order to think, you need to be able to speak. These things are inextricably linked. And as we hash out ideas, as what we're doing right now, our ability to explore ideas requires us to be able to speak about them and to publicize them. So that's the first thing. It recognizes the dignity of the individual by allowing him to explore his own ideas and to speak. And the only way to arrive at truths is through this free exchange of ideas. In the marketplace of ideas, you have to be able to challenge ideas and win people over with your arguments. And this is where Milton said, in warning about restricting freedom of speech, he said, if the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and lively impression of truth produced by its collision with error. So that's why these are the most. It's why it's the First Amendment. Why it's the most important item in our Bill of Rights. So we have to know what people think to be able to challenge those ideas, and we also want to know. I have a friend here, a kind of lefty friend, who's always going on about how tolerant he is, except if you want to talk about climate change. He will not tolerate any discussion on climate change. He will not tolerate any question on abridging a woman's right to have an abortion. Get him on the Second Amendment, and he blows his top. So he's very tolerant of all sorts of ideas that he agrees with already. And the point of the First Amendment is to protect those worst ideas, to protect the ideas, because in protecting those most offensive ideas, you protect all ideas. And that's why this is so important. And in doing that, you create a sort of a pressure valve. So if you start limiting people's speech and ability to express even the most heinous ideas, you create this pressure valve, and it comes out in worse and perhaps uglier ways. Just one block from here, last week we had pro-Hamas protesters marching up and down the streets. I found their ideas deeply offensive to me, but they're allowed to do them, and I'm glad that they're out there doing them, because I want to know who they are. I want to know and understand their ideas, even if they're offensive. And we've had, I think, more than 900, maybe 930 Supreme Court cases brought to the First Amendment Supreme Court cases. In fact, just yesterday, there was another case. So these are constantly being tested in the court of to what the limits are of free speech. And for at least the last 30 or 40 years, the Supreme Court has strengthened our free speech rights and has stopped any kind of, whether it's flag burning. So famously, Justice Scalia came out in favor of flag burning, even though this is deeply offensive to conservatives, the conservative that he was. You're allowed to do that as long as it's your flag that you're burning. You can't burn somebody else's flag. But, there was famous cases like the Skokie, the Nazis marching through Skokie, this suburb in Illinois, that was home to a very large, considerably Jewish neighborhood, home to Holocaust survivors. And they allowed Nazis to march through there because that was their free speech rights. You're allowed to express yourself. What actually ended up happening was that there was a counter-protest of people who were anti-Nazi and were counter-protesting, and that's the way you want to get this done. But this right has been defended again and again successfully in the Supreme Court. And have you heard of the Westboro Baptist Church? They're these kind of nutty Baptists who they're less active now, but during the Iraq War, they would come out. They're obsessed with homosexuality. They're obsessed with the gays, which makes you wonder what on earth's going on there. But anyway, they would go to soldiers' funerals, soldiers who had fallen in battle, and they would protest in the most disgusting way because those soldiers in fighting and defending the United States were, defending gay rights. And so they would go there and make these disgusting comments about how we're all going to go to hell. And they were sued, and the Supreme Court said they're allowed to do this. And in the current Chief Justice, Justice Roberts, wrote, "We don't punish the extremist speaker. Instead, we have chosen a different course to protect even hurtful speech on public issues to ensure that we don't stifle public debate." So, this goes on, again and again. It's as we've seen with other countries starting to restrict speech. The United States, thank God, is going in a different direction. That those defending speech have changed. It used to be in the 60s, it was that the political left that were more free speech and the right that was wanting more censorship. That's switched now. It's the right that has come to defend free speech and the left that is more censorious. And yeah, I don't want to bang on too long. We've got a lot to get through, but that's where we are. Free speech is alive and well here, and thank goodness we have a Supreme Court that defends it.
James?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of raise one question. I mean, a few years ago, until Elon Musk bought Twitter, basically, you had very, very coordinated censorship campaigns, secret censorship campaigns directed against speech that was often true and in the public interest. So you would have Google suppressing search results, Twitter de-amplifying certain sort of accounts, especially during the COVID epidemic, and that sort of thing. Has the Supreme Court actually made any decisions saying that behavior by those platforms at that time was wrong or not?
Well, those are private platforms. They can do whatever they like. YouTube doesn't, which is a Google company, doesn't have to run whatever we want. They could take this off if they want. I hope they don't. But if they find us offensive, that's a private company. It's up to them. The question is the government allowed? So if the state is putting pressure on Google, which they did during COVID, and on Facebook and on Twitter to take stuff down, that is illegal. And I think you're right. The Supreme Court has ruled on this. This is not acceptable. So private companies can do what they like here. It's when the state gets involved and starts directing them on their behalf to take down content, that is then violating the First Amendment. That's my understanding. And that certainly happened. It's under the Biden administration, the bullying, the jawboning that went on. And Mark Zuckerberg has spoken about this directly. That is illegal. But if Mark Zuckerberg decides he wants to take down something because he doesn't want it up there, it's his company. And you know what we do? We go to somewhere else. we go on some other company, or we get off social media. You start talking to your neighbors instead of posting, whatever. There are alternatives.
And Richard, I wanted to talk to you before we move to Simon to kind of give the kind of reverse of what's happening in the UK. A point that France has raised in a couple of discussions that we've had, which is this idea that there's two ways that a society can change. They can change peacefully, or it can change violently. And the reason why, what is actually so fundamentally important about freedom of speech is that it is the thing that greases the wheel to allow for peaceful change. That you need the constant conflict and exchange of ideas in order for people to maintain a system in which peaceful change can happen. Because the only way that you allow ideas to die, as opposed to the people who hold the ideas, is for those ideas to be constantly fought out. And so with what is so why the founders put the First Amendment at the top, maybe without even realizing it, was what that the easiest way to remove the kind of grease to stop peaceful changeover from happening is to stop allowing people the free exchange of ideas, because that means that people start to suspect that that their neighbor are much worse than they actually are, because it turns out that generally when people talk with one another and communicate, even in the most difficult of circumstances, they come closer together. And so it's that very fact that you cannot actually have a continual handover, a peaceful change of power without this kind of grease.
Yes, and as I said so often, the answer to bad speech, ideas that you disagree with, is not less speech; it's more speech. You want more ideas out there. You don't start restricting people's ability to speak. The best way is to argue against it, and to So when people are marching the streets here talking about genocide, the best answer is not to stop them from doing that. Is to explain to them that they're morons, and how they're wrong. That's the answer. And that does stop us getting to blows. Unfortunately,
And
we
so,
still have blows, but we have less.
And so, Simon, I think this leads very nicely into your second topic of today, which is you're going to tell us about how the UK is going in the opposite direction to the US in terms of finding every opportunity it can to restrict the freedom of speech of people. So, can you lay us out some
Sure.
context
So
and some
I
examples of when this has
spoke to you
happened?
guys 3 weeks ago on the subject of Graham Linehan being collared at Heathrow Airport, and France was absent. But I vividly remember telling you this wasn't the last time this was going to happen. And what happened? 3 weeks later, a guy called Pete North gets arrested at his house at night. He's in the north of England. He's a political commentator. His father was a political commentator. They're Brexit guys. Some of their stuff might be a little bit too red meat. I find some of their stuff a little quite interesting. It's not my usual, but they make coherent arguments. And Pete North's crime was to make a meme that said F Hamas. So he's gone F Hamas in a meme, and he's been arrested by the police. All right. The government prescribed Hamas as a terrorist organization. The police are supposed to work for the government. Okay. So you can see how this thing, it's like, the way I describe it is that it's like, it's not the pattern of a bee, which is unpredictable. It's like taking a toileting baboon into the Hemingway's bar at the Ritz in Paris and letting it just go wild. Okay. That's where this whole thing is now. And, I say again, as per Pete North, as per Graham Linehan, it is not the last time that this is going to happen. Now, conversely, we've just heard that a Palestinian doctor who made a slitting gesture, which is like that, at a protest to people who she didn't like, she's entitled to freedom of speech. So there's already that imbalance coming. But the whole point here, guys, is that we talk about free speech in the UK as if it's something that can be repaired or retrieved. It's gone past that. We, for the last 10 years, and America is a lot to blame, certainly the self-appointed censorship panel at Twitter, we've taken this divine power that has been responsible for so much of civilization. Okay, at the point at which civilization peaked, and you can choose your date for that, whether it was our ability to end war or the final construction pieces of Notre Dame in Paris. At that point, you could have looked at the legacy of humanity and see what has created all of this. And freedom of speech would have been one of the foundations, the free exchange of ideas, the best idea triumphing. And here we have completely scrapped any vestigial tale of Magna Carta. And as I said, we've allowed the wrong people to have a power which they should have no purpose and no geographical proximity to. So we're in this position now. So let's take my point at face value. If we are talking about something that's gone, we can only respond symptomatically. Now, Pete North being the latest, what do you do? I've actually had a guy who's about to publish quite a serious book ask me on how one defends themselves against the response of the state and the monitoring of the state. And my advice to them was to do the following. You've got to find yourself a lawyer. You've got to find yourself, in fact, a tenacious ambulance chaser. Take him out to lunch and get his number onto your phone. Get representation from the Free Speech Union here, but as limited as they are, it's important. And get yourself a membership card to a good union like the British Union of Journalists. Create a WhatsApp group where all three are on. And the moment that knock from the police comes, you press that number, because the reality is what they're doing is the process being the punishment. They want people to fess up in plea agreements about, yes, I did this and this is offensive and so on. But, if Gabriel, there'll be no shortage of future examples. There'll be no shortage of future victims. The reality is that we're in a position of only being able to respond symptomatically, because that is how fast things go when you mess with this. When you interfere, you've lost control. And who is to say, you've given it to politicians, who is to say that because the left guys are putting the right guys into jail, when the right guys, they come in, they're going to put the left guys into jail? That is the net result of this. And I think there are examples that you can see in other countries of where that this is happening now. I understand that there are 12,000 people charged with non-crime hate incidents in the UK, which and let's just look at that. This is a very, very important point. We could speak an entire episode. The five of us could do 2 hours of where this is in the institutions, particularly in the universities, okay, and their damage to that. But for our audience and for the purpose of us just being here now, I want to drip feed two issues of how we came to this point, two sources of how we got here. And the first is within the police itself, who have prioritized non-crime hate incidents, basically hate speech on social media. Why is this happening, you ask? Okay, as I spoke to you guys about, Graham Linehan quickly discovered that the police is a captured institution. And who's it captured by? It's the lobby groups, it's the interest parties. And what have they done? Someone like Stonewall. They've gone into the police, into constabularies across the land, and they've said, right, we've identified that DCO or that constable or whatever, and we're going to appoint them diversity champion or LGBT champion. So you have got an external force essentially incentivizing an organ of the state, which is not on. Okay, so that's where the police are. They want to find agency and status in pursuing these sorts of things. That's the first, the police. That's why they're in that position. The second is, we also have to look back beyond their self-appointed censors at Twitter, beyond to the rise of this disinformation racket. And I want to point out one particularly egregious example of this. There is a organization called the Global Disinformation Index, or the GDI. It's run by a woman called Claire Melford. Okay. And what they did was that they created essentially a slow poison, the gradual dissemination of ideas of which media were acceptable and which weren't. So they produced this index. And you go back to that index, and they did it yearly, and you find that all the media that's acceptable is on the political left, and all the media that's unacceptable is on the political right. And what does that do over time? Well, it comes to a collective conclusion, a consensus that that media on the right, that Fox News, that Reason, whoever you choose, is actually lying, spreading evil, and should actually be stopped. They should be, in various ways, they should be stopped. So those are the two forces that I'll introduce to you today in a much more elaborate discussion about what has actually happened and what the future holds. And that's probably something that you could bring in quite nicely with digital identification at some point. But that's where this is now. We can only respond symptomatically because people who do not deserve to touch this power have fiddled with it, have perverted it, and ended up in a position where we are more divided than ever, and we have more distrust of our neighbors than it. I think you'd have to go back to the Middle Ages when men knocked out their neighbors' wives with clubs and stole them and dragged them into their caves. I think that's probably where, at the last point, as a result of this rubbish, we find ourselves.
James?
I just wanted to ask, I mean, it's obviously people on the right who are getting arrested in this way, at least in the public realm. But, one knows from the sort of so-called trans debates that someone like J.K. Rowling gets subjected, and gender critical feminists, or whatever the right term is, gets subjected to the most horrific abuse and death threats. And at many of these protests, there are posters with "kill the TERFs" or whatever. Are the people on the other side of the debate getting arrested, or is it purely if you counterpunch, then the police come and feel your collar, like with Graham Linehan?
Yeah. So to the point earlier, there is almost certainly the appearance of two-tier justice as it comes to who is being arrested and who's being allowed to say what they want. I gave the example of the Palestinian doctor this weekend. There's another example of a Muslim barrister who said the most astonishing things about the terrorist attack last week in Manchester on Thursday. We're not a week from it, and neither of these people have been disciplined. Neither of them, to say nothing, not even arrested. Of course not. And what's been emphasized in the wake of their commentary has been their right to free speech, which is. But these are the things that happen. Is that once you've lost control of it, you can't control how it looks either. And I think very sadly is that the left don't actually understand that when the political power shifts to the right, which it looks to be doing, is that these guys will abuse that just as much as guys on the left are doing now. For the most part, it is right-wing people, you could say, but there's also been right-wing people who are arrested under the Conservatives. So I don't want to, I wouldn't say that the police are primed to the right at the moment. That may change, but there are certainly a lot more people who would claim to be on that position that have been arrested than those on the left.
Richard?
Yeah, we have a sort of phrase that we hear a lot here, and maybe this accounts for some of the disparities here, where you're accused of punching down if you make a joke or something against a trans person or a gay or some other minority. That is punching down. And maybe that accounts for why some are arrested and some aren't. But it's such an extraordinary thing. First of all, it's a nonsense term. The law should apply equally to everybody. And I don't even think that these non-crime hate incidents are actually in the law. This is something dreamt up by the police, not in Parliament. But the whole idea of punching down is so patronizing. You're assuming that people who are different to you are somehow weaker and that you're the strong one. It's such an offensively patronizing idea. Anyway, I just want to make that.
Yeah, I mean, just to there is you have this idea that that the left, certainly, and the causes they support are more vulnerable, and are therefore deserving of more compassion, which also factors into this. And to Richard's question about the police making this up, the Royal College of Policing's guidebook has been perverted very, very badly. And I know a chap who's actually got that adjusted. He won a court case at the Old Bailey 2 years ago. Nothing has happened. The judge ordered revisions in the Royal College of Policing's guidebook, and they haven't done it. So, if you don't want us to go around spreading conspiracies or talking, then action what you're told to do by the courts. But yeah, I do think, certainly, Rich, that the idea of the left's luxury beliefs being fragile and need to be protected and are warranted is certainly prevalent here.
Yeah, so I think that kind of covers the topic very well. Thank you to Rich and Simon for that incredible double act, the kind of yin and yang that we've got to see in America and the US, America and the UK. And so we're going to move back to South Africa for hopefully our last two, at least one topic, and that's we're going to start with you, James. You've got an update on the political party funding and on the ANC.
Yeah, well, it's the sort of long-running sort of soap opera with the ANC of it's all. The ANC as an organisation always running out of money. I think the relevant context is just to remember how much the political parties, represented political parties in South Africa, actually get from the state. And I think for the last figures, which were for 2023 to 2024, which were, so that's running up to the last election, essentially. I think the state allocated about 2.2 billion rand to parties over the year, and it's allocated proportionally. So the ANC got about 1.2 billion rand. So that is a lot of money to run a political party on. And the fact that the ANC can't run itself within that budget is, of course, a sign of its perennial financial indiscipline, which goes back decades. And it also points to the sort of bizarre nature of its economic plan, that if it can't even sort of run itself, how is it going to sort of run these complicated state institutions to get the economy going? And then, before the 2019 election, it contracted this company, I think, Ezulweni Investments, to produce posters. It didn't pay afterwards. The ANC fought it. Then, after a series of court rulings, it reached a settlement, and some of the money was paid, and Ezulweni was then contracted to produce more material for the 2024 elections. It failed to pay that money, and now the ANC is having its assets attached again. I just want to make a word of caution, which I will whenever we speak about ANC funding, is that the ANC has trusts which sit outside the organisation. One of them is the Barto Trust, the other is the Chancellor's Trust. And I think these institutions are sitting on a lot of money. But for whatever reason, the trusts don't hand over the money to the ANC to pay off these debts. So that's the current excitement, is the ANC as an organisation running short of cash again.
Yeah, and so how does it work that Frans, I'll come to you in a second. Just one question: how does it work that the ANC can have these trusts that you say have enough money, but that they organization, like, why would they constantly be running out of money, um, with access to sufficient funding, if they do have access to sufficient funding?
Well, the trustees of the trusts can say no to the funding requests of the ANC, and I think this has always been a source of tension between them. To what degree those trusts are independent of the ANC, I don't know. But it also means that if you want to sue the ANC, you can't actually go after its investment assets, because the ANC itself doesn't have any capital. The capital is housed in the trust, or at least has been historically. And if you look at the funding reports, the ANC gets most of its money from its trusts in terms of its so-called private funding. But you don't get told where the trusts get their money from. But it's a historic structure that was set up in the early 90s.
Franz, to you, and then to Simon after that.
This is very important what James says about the 2 billion, because I don't think many people know that. When people think or talk about party funding in South Africa, they think about the few private donors, of which there are very, very few. 5 or 6 really serious ones, and they might give their 10 or 15, I don't know what the threshold is now, 20 million rand a year.
30 million now.
30, it's gone to 30. Oh, yeah, yes, it's 30. 30 a year, but there's 2 billion rand of taxpayers' money going into political parties. And so the private donations sort of pale into relative insignificance. The second thing I want to ask is, do we care that parties disclose their funding or not? It's been made into an issue in South Africa through a piece of legislation called the Party Funding Act. Every donation has to be declared, etc. The argument one might make on that is that this is a device to undermine the growth of new parties and parties that are of a nature that they would tend to be law-abiding and therefore comply with these sort of disclosure requirements. And that the law was introduced in some respects to head off the prospect that as the ANC began to fail and people began to lose their fear of it, and wealthy people began to worry about South Africa's future because Mr. Ramaphosa hadn't been a success and they'd had great confidence that he would be, that the risk was that vast private funding might be put into political alternatives to the ANC, and that what the Party Funding Act has been able to do is to stop that. I mean, and in fact, to stigmatize the idea of private contributions to political parties, to try and sell the idea to the public that there's something terribly wrong if a political party is not willing, it's underhanded if a political party is not willing to disclose the sort of name and address of all its all its donors. And I think this has done great damage to the country's democracy because it's greatly limited the scope for new political alternatives to arise, and it gives a disproportionate advantage to established, let's say, legacy parties who split this enormous pot of cash between them every year, which a startup party just has obviously cannot access.
Just to add to the point, that the ANC, obviously it got this huge amount of state money, and then it also got 400 million rand in donations that it's then said, well, these fall outside the act, so we don't have to disclose them. And then obviously it got its 30 million rand at that time from its trusts. So in terms of the amount of money that it actually disclosed where the money was coming from, was nominal. And with the EFF and MK, they also don't disclose any significant private funding, although they clearly run very well-funded election campaigns, as did the ANC up to a point, I suppose. So this law that was meant to bring transparency to funding has not affected, as far as one can see, has not actually brought any transparency to how those parties are funded, but it has obviously severely squeezed the sort of more law-abiding parties like the Democratic Alliance, Action SA, or whatever.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Sorry, Gabriel, I interrupt you. I wouldn't be surprised if it came out in the fullness of time that that law had origins in the state and was created in order to just dampen the prospects of new opposition parties challenging South Africa's status quo. Sorry, Gabriel, Simon.
Simon, over to you.
Francis just asked exactly my question about where did that law come from. So yeah, I was thinking the same thing. The second, just thinking out loud here with regard to this seizing of assets, attaching of assets. Surely at some point the ANC, the financial services that the party has, they have to make some sort of noise or announcement that they have delinquent clients. I mean, who is that? Has that ever happened before? That the banks have come out and just says, "Guys, we can't do this. We just can't deal with a political party that has held power for so long that is essentially being sequestrated." I mean, I'm not sure if it has, but I just thought it might be an interesting note to explore.
I mean, it would place those institutions in a very difficult position.
Exactly.
James, do you have anything to add on Simon's point?
Not more than that. I think the ANC has always run a huge bank overdraft. So the banks have, in a way, helped fund the ANC over many, many years. And then at some point, some rich donor of uncertain provenance has come in and paid off that bank overdraft. And then immediately the bank overdraft starts increasing again. So that's been but at some point maybe the banks will no longer be as frightened as they were of the ANC, as it has been historically, and then I think maybe things start getting interesting then.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we're going to try and squeeze now, France. It's something that's a little difficult for you to do, but I'm going to have to ask you to keep the length of this last section a little bit down because we're running quite close to the end. But you have guaranteed that we have to get to it by prefacing it earlier in the show. So can you tell us about the polling that shows that the ANC is being overtaken by its voters?
I'm always concise, so that won't be a problem. So we started earlier on South Africa. We spoke about the ANC's new plan and that it sort of has these throwbacks to sort of 1950 Soviet central planning. A nice kind of bookend for that is data that the Social Research Foundation has produced over the past 3 years. And what that data did is to test public opinion on policies, because there's an idea that does the rounds in South Africa that's completely wrong. That the government, the ANC, the cabinet would love to move towards reform, but it just cannot, because ordinary people are so attached to the ANC's legacy policies, it would be suicidal to change them. Now we can demonstrate that that's not correct. So here's some examples. It's put to a poll of 3,000 respondents. The following: businesses that are not BE compliant should not be allowed to operate until they become compliant, or a business should be allowed to operate even if it is not BE compliant, as long as it pays tax and employs people and creates jobs. Now, amongst all voters, 77.8% said they agreed with the latter status. If you are paying tax, creating jobs, your BE status doesn't matter. You should be free to operate as you choose. Amongst ANC voters, that was 79%, who in practice have said, they're saying two things. They're saying, one, BE is perceived as something that makes businesses do social good. But if the business already does social good, there's no need for it to do BE. And that's quite if you were a reformer, quite a comfortable position to be in as a policymaker, but you could just demonstrate to the public what is true, that businesses that invest in the economy and carry on, that are solvent, are a social good in the main. So there's no need to try and classify their empowerment contribution after the fact. Then how's this one? The middle classes should pay more tax because, it goes on to say middle class people don't contribute enough. And it says middle class specifically, so you don't think we mean tax the poor. Or straight up, the middle classes should pay less tax. Now, 73% of all South Africans and 64% of ANC voters, so 2 in 3, straight up, the middle classes should pay less tax. So the idea that the wealthy get away with murder and don't contribute are false. Then here's another one. The government should appoint the best candidates to jobs, regardless of their race. Do you agree or disagree with this? And 87% of all South Africans said we agree with that. And 84% of ANC voters said they agree with it as well. So the idea that you just cannot cross these lines of policy because there'll be a rebellion, a revolution, the state will be overthrown, turns out not to be true. Then, just staying with the theme, a future coalition government, this was just before the GNU, should make race-based rules stricter, or it should get rid of race-based appointments completely. And 64.1% of all voters and exactly 64% of ANC voters said get rid of it completely. Then let's carry on. Expropriating land without paying compensation to the owner is a good idea. Do you agree with that or disagree with that? And 66.2% of all South Africans said they disagree that that is a good idea. And in the ANC camp, it was 61%. So we said earlier, is the position in the country depressing, or is it something else? And I suggested it's depressing if you're inside the ANC camp, certainly. But more broadly, one of South Africa's great countervailing forces is that its people are completely centrist and moderate and pragmatic. And that, in fact, on questions of policy, they have far overtaken the positions of their government and the positions of the ANC. And it's almost, I think, there's this quote about the ANC and its economic policy, that it's a man sitting backwards on a donkey. He thinks he's riding towards you, towards the solution, but he's actually riding further away. And what we saw this week with the new economic action plan and its many state committees and revitalized infrastructure building cadres, and you juxtapose that against this kind of data, you can actually be quite hopeful about where South Africa is headed. More so, I think, once you've listened to Simon and so on, and where the UK is at with freedom of speech. 12,000 people arrested annually for speech offenses. I wonder on a per capita basis if that's higher or lower than Russia and China. It's a valid question now. And South Africa, completely free and open society, very little of that sort of thing goes on. And the public is completely sensible and pragmatic. And if the government listened to its people, South Africa's economy would be growing at 4%. Gabriel.
Simon, you want to have a last point before we end?
Sure, it's a great. Francis has done a very good thing here, and it's a great point to end on. And I don't think we should let James get away here, because Germany is also up there. It doesn't have as many as 12,000 people arrested annually, but it's closing at around 8. And nowadays, it seems that every politician there is being knocked off. So. To Francis' point, I think that's we ended with South Africa on top at the end of this.
Yes, thank you. I think it's a great place to leave it. That in fact, if you're looking around the world, there are few places that you should be more optimistic on the future of than our home. Although there's there's some pain and awkwardness and change that still needs to happen, I think the prospects of South Africa are the brightest out of all of the countries we've looked at. And so I want to thank you to our panel for the excellent contributions today, and I want to thank you at home for tuning in. And please come again next week for another episode of South Africa's Best News Podcast. I'm Gabriel Makin, and this has been Making Sense.